Thanks everybody for coming. And we got a good crowd. I suspect it would be bigger if not for the fact that a lot of the preservationists in town are at the Knox Heritage annual awards dinner. We didn't think about that, but of course we're always on a third Thursday of the month anyway. But thanks for coming, and maybe they can watch the recording later. Fort Sanders, of course, has been a focus of a lot of effort by preservationists over the last 50 years, and there have been successes and failures in that regard. But that's part of the drama of Fort Sanders. I have a little background with Fort Sanders myself. As someone on the radio today reminded me, my mother lived there in the late 30s and early 40s in an apartment on the west side of the neighborhood. And I lived on the east side of the neighborhood for about 6 years in the late 70s and early 80s. And it was, to me, my briar patch. It was just a wonderful, fascinating, perplexing place to live. And I think was part of what bred my interest in my hometown. It was a very complicated, just interesting, constantly interesting place, just in the present and what we could see of the past. But I want to give a little background of Fort Sanders, what it was because it has about a 200-year history, if you count everything that's happened there. It was originally farmland, and it was the home of a guy named Hugh A.M. White, who is known mainly. I don't know what he looked like. He died in 1860, but we have his gravestone. This is his gravestone, and actually see his wife's name up top. Wife of H.A.M. White, and then H.A.M. White himself. He died at age 57 in 1860. He's buried at Old Gray Cemetery. But he was the best known occupant of the Fort Sanders area before the Civil War. He was, of course, he was a grandson of James White, the founder of Knoxville, and the nephew of Hugh Lawson White. He was probably named for Hugh Lawson White, who was a very, very prominent U.S. senator on the national scene. He ran for president. Hugh Lawson White did in 1836, and I've tried and failed to determine exactly where Hugh Lawson White lived when he lived in Knoxville in his later years, but he may have lived on this property as well. We know that H.A.M. White did. He lived in a house on the site of what's now the what they call it, what they used to call home ec, that building just to the east of the Hoskins Library. But he was the guy that lived there earlier. They called this White's Addition, and that's because of White's role in owning this place. White's Addition was what its first name. Of course, White had died before they began Jesse Harris Building. That's right. That was where White lived. But this was before he died, before he saw fortifications built on the ridge up above his home. First by the Confederates, who built some at least rudimentary defenses up there on the crest of the hill. But later on in 1863, the Union Army under Burnside and Orlando Poe and others built what we know as what became known as Fort Sanders. Was named for William Pitt Sanders, who was killed as a result of a wound he received defending Knoxville from the Confederate assault from the west along Kingston Pike, but he died downtown. Yeah, here's a pretty romantic picture of the assault from the Confederate point of view. But that's what the fort looked like. It was a great big ominous earthworks up on the top of the hill. And this assault, which was a terrible idea, was repulsed with massive Confederate casualties. Consider it was only 20 minutes before they realized it was a mistake, and they stopped the assault. After 129 were killed on the site, and hundreds more wounded who probably died later. A very brief but violent episode in the war. They say it was the bloodiest 20 minutes of the war. Some people, it's hard to prove, but that 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 claim has been made. Of course, it was just rubble after the war. A lot of bumpy ground, just as you see now. This is what it looked like for a long time. It looks like a desert. They had cut down a lot of trees. A lot of other trees were destroyed in the actual fighting. So there was not forest, there were not houses, there was really nothing except for the remains of the fort up at the top of the hill. This is roughly in the vicinity of 17th Street and 18th Street along between Clinch and Laurel and Highland area. But that was this fort that may have been completely impregnable. When Sherman came to town right after the battle, he said, "This is the best defended city I've ever seen in my career." It was a tough nut to crack, and the Confederates did not crack it. What it was a battleground after that, and what to do with it. It was actually in the early days after the Civil War, there was not a lot of interest in preserving this stuff. They just wanted to forget about the war, put it behind them, and just build on the battlefield, and that's what people did. The development aspirations for development started fairly soon after the war, and it's interesting to see this map. I think we have a map, don't we, Paul, from 1867? Yeah, this is I mentioned this is called White's Edition. This is before it was called West End or Fort Sanders or anything else. But this is the area just outside of city limits. What you see on the right is downtown Knoxville. And you see on the very top, it says grounds of the asylum. That's the building that's still there and that I can see out my window right now. That's the Lincoln Memorial University Law School now. But that was the deaf and dumb asylum, or the forerunner of the Tennessee School for the Deaf. But that shows you where that was in perspective of the blue outlined area, which is the early part of development of what we know as Fort Sanders. You recognize a couple of names there. Clinch Avenue, of course, kind of runs through it in the same place that it does today. Grove Street was later called Laurel Avenue. Bridge, a little part of Bridge still exists. I think Cedar was later Highland, if I'm not mistaken. But anyway, that and you see it's not the streets are not numbered yet, and this is what it looked like in 1867. These are plots, and I don't think many of these are actual houses yet, but they were actually envisioning houses here at least. So that was what that looks like. And I apologize for this picture. This was taken through. Those lights are the lights of the McClung collection, the ceiling lights, and this is just a great fascinating map on the wall that all of you who've been to McClung collection have seen this. The earliest really detailed map, thickly detailed map of Knoxville. All right, this is a little bit later. Some of the same streets have the same names. You see Clinch and then Grove above it. Dickinson Street is about where 16th Street is now, and it was called that, I think, because the Cowan family, who were kin to the Dickinsons, were just the next house over there. But you see Fort Sanders Avenue over going off, and this is called Kingston Pike in 1886. It's now Cumberland Avenue, but Fort Sanders Avenue goes right up to the fort, and that is roughly kind of parallel to what we think of as 17th Street today. But the fort was still there, very much so, 23 years after the battle, and it was kind of a tourist attraction. People went there, deliberately to see the fort. Many times veterans went there. In fact, in 1890, the big blue-gray reunion was held on the ramparts of the fort, and they had a giant fireworks display with both Union and Confederate veterans there to witness the thing. It might have, you can't imagine what some of them might have put them into some kind of a post-traumatic shock or something to see explosions again on those ramparts. But anyway, that was there. What that was to the right there, that it looks like a reservoir of some sort. I've never quite been able to figure that out, but that's about where the Rose Hole was. Actually, the Rose Hole was below that. Anyway, that was something adjacent to the fort. But you see the University down there at the bottom. That was the University of Tennessee by that time. So that's the hill with those buildings on top, and South College is the only one that's still standing there on exactly. That's right where it is on the right side. Okay, and here's another picture of the whole of Knox County. This is also framed on the wall at McClellan Collection. We've got a good copy of it thanks to Paul here at KHP. But you see this yellow patch is called West Knoxville, and we have our own ideas of what West Knoxville is today. But West Knoxville in 1895 was the official designation of what we know as Fort Sanders now. West Knoxville, especially the part above Cumberland Avenue, West Knoxville was outside of city limits of Knoxville, but it had been incorporated as its own town. It was a town with its own leadership. It was obviously a suburb. Almost everybody lived there, worked in Knoxville, but that was what it was called back in the 1890s. By the way, it was called West End by 1880 by people who lived there. The first people who lived there called it West End, and I love the description of one of them. Anne Armstrong lived there late about this time. Actually, in 1885 is when she moved there. The novelist. I'll talk a little bit about her later. We have a whole new descriptions of Fort Sanders we never had before, thanks to Linda Barrand and of Time and Knoxville, which was just published this year by the novelist Anne Armstrong. But she lived here as a girl, not quite 13-year-old girl, moved here in 1885, and she loved West End, and it became kind of her Eden in Knoxville. And she just lived in different places in Knoxville, lived in different places in America, but then kept coming back to West End. But they called it West End, and she described it as being deliberately called that after the fashionable part of London. Several people who lived in Fort Sanders had been to London and knew that West End was a fashionable place, and they wanted their West End to be like that too. And it on a good day, maybe it was. All right, we're getting into the actual tour itself, and we're starting on Clinch Avenue. And this is the Bernadotte Schmidt House, which has an especially interesting distinction. A couple of interesting distinctions. One is that it was the home of Bernadotte Schmidt, who was, we might think of James Agee as the Pulitzer Prize winner who grew up in Fort Sanders, but this is Bernadotte Schmidt, another Pulitzer Prize winner who grew up in Fort Sanders. He was a more academic fellow than Agee was. He was a historian. And in 1930, he wrote an interesting book called The Coming of War, 1914. It was about what caused World War I, which was just the World War when Schmidt was writing about it. But Schmidt actually went to Europe and spent a day with Kaiser Wilhelm, who was still alive and living in exile on a farm in Belgium, I believe. But he tracked him down somehow and got to spend the day with him to figure out what the hell happened back in 1914, and won the Pulitzer Prize for that book. But he was a respected scholar and historian for the rest of his life. He grew up in this house, which was a house built in 1896 by his father, Cooper Schmidt, who was a well-known scholar at UT. Cooper Schmidt was a mathematics professor, and there's a plaque in his memory at the Austin Peay building on the hill. But Cooper Schmidt built this very stylish kind of Victorian house with a porch and so forth. You might notice this house, though there's something odd about it. The porch wraps around to the kind of the alley between it and the next house, not as you would expect on the outside. And that's because this house was a corner house, but not built on this corner. It was built down on 13th and White, and was there until about 7 years ago. And it was actually moved several blocks from its original location, where Bernadotte Schmidt and his father, Cooper Schmidt, and his mother, everybody else knew it, moved it up to this place, and now it's a residence again. But it's a Herculean task that we're grateful to the developer for doing that. Even though it, of course, when you move a house, as far as National Park Service is concerned, it's a new house. You have to start the clock over to judge its as a historic structure. It's like an artifact that's been moved and has to find its new history in the new location. But that I'm glad it's there at least. But it's a nice block of Clinch that still has several historic homes on it, so it's not the worst place for it. In fact, right across the street from it is a house that's maybe not quite as well preserved, but some people believe this is the oldest house in Fort Sanders. It may date to the 1870s, and it has an interesting point of reference and personally with it because you may know of the story of the inventor Weston Fulton, who established Fulton Silphon. Much later on in his life, he built a mansion on Lyons View known as Westcliff, and it, of course, was torn down mostly in the 1960s. And his more recent house on UT campus was torn down about 10 years ago before the University Center was built, the new one, the new student center. But this is where he lived before that. This is where his wife's parents lived, and this is where he was married to his wife of many, many years, and they had many children together, but they had the big wedding here in, I think, 1910 or so. But he was just a meteorologist with aspirations to invent lots of things at the time that he got married here and lived here with his in-laws. This was a typical pattern in those days. We found several families that had 2 or even 3 generations living together in the same house. That was very, very common in those days. I don't know if they drove each other crazy or not. Maybe that's what saloons were for back then. But you'd get out of the house for a while. But anyway, I'm glad at least something is left of this house here. But this was, I think, Ron Childress in 1977 determined that he thought this house was the oldest in Fort Sanders. Next one, please. All right, we don't have her house. Her house apparently was torn down maybe 100 years or more ago. But Anne Armstrong, this is the book that is just published brand new this year, edited by Linda Barron, who I believe is with us tonight. But this is a fascinating memoir, how many pages? 450, 500 pages long, written by a modern writer remembering Knoxville as it was in the 1880s and 90s. Anne Armstrong wrote this book in the 1950s after writing 2 interesting and in different ways successful novels in the 20th century. Remembered her early youth in Fort Sanders. She was from Michigan, but she moved here with her father, who was a very prominent capitalist here in 1885. They arrived here. They were, I think we'd call them a wealthy family when they arrived here. But she went through lots of changes in Knoxville. She knew poverty and she saw lots of tragedy in her life. When they lived in Fort Sanders, her brother drowned in the river. Her beloved brother Harry drowned in the river. Her father was severely maimed in a train accident and train wreck in 1889, the terrible Flat Creek train wreck, the second worst train wreck in Knoxville area history after the New Market wreck. And he never really recovered, was bedridden for part of the rest of his life, but got a little bit better, but then died very young, probably as a result of that accident. But she got to see his fortunes dwindle away as he could not do his former jobs anymore. And the family just moved from one rental place. They rented a house in Fort Sanders, planning to build a big fancy house in Fort Sanders, and just never were able to do it. And they lived in small rental places most of her time here. And the third tragedy in her life was that she had a horrible first marriage to an violently abusive husband. Then that part of that took place in Fort Sanders too. But it's remarkable, considering all that, that I want to just read this little passage from of Time in Knoxville. I at least would always look back nostalgically for all the tragedy mixed with happiness during the crucial years we lived there. She's talking about Fort Sanders. But she, by the way, knew the Schmidts well. She knew a lot of the people of Fort Sanders. She talks about the Schmidts and the Schmidts lately built Victorian mansion. No, no, I'm sorry, the Schmidts lately built Queen Anne house stretched the Woodruff's rose garden at the rear of the Woodruff's huge Victorian mansion. And with its great fountain and its extensive grounds facing the university, the Woodruff House was down where the where Hoskins Library is, and that was very close to where the Schmidts lived originally. I mentioned, of course, where the house was originally, and they moved it later. But anyway, that's it's a fascinating read. It has more color to it than any book I've ever read about any personal book about Knoxville, and a lot of it is about Fort Sanders. Which she, of course, called West End. All right, this is the beginning of something that's known as Widow's Row, the 1400 block of Clinch Avenue. And I thank Holly Cook for squaring some of the details of this. And this was one of the famous widows. Mary Imes was Joseph Imes' widow. Joseph Imes was the superintendent of the School for the Deaf. Very prominent figure. He died rather young. Mary's son, Harry Imes, H.B. Imes, was the guy that founded the family refuge, the bird sanctuary that we know is Imes Nature Center. But we're glad that his mother's house is still standing on Clinch Avenue. But apparently 9 different widows built houses, perhaps in some cases smaller than the houses that their families had lived in, but just houses to live their widowhood. This is certainly not a small house at all, but it's still there. A lot of the houses in Fort Sanders are covered with plastic or aluminum siding, and that's unfortunate, but it's better than losing them altogether. And maybe someone will come along and fix them up and make them look like they did when people like Mary Imes lived there. Next one, please. All right, here's the Reuben Payne house, which is at the other end of the block. It's actually not of the Reuben Payne himself, but his widow that built this house. Reuben Payne was a guy, interesting fellow, who was a Confederate veteran who had been a haberdasher in New York later after the war, and then later moved to Knoxville and became mayor for a short time in the early 1880s. Died of tuberculosis, and it's interesting that he appears in Anne Armstrong's book because he tried to kiss her once, and very, very politely, it seems, and she rebuffed him. Fortunately, because he may have already had TB at the time, but he died not too long after that. But his widow lived here for quite a while, apparently, at the other end of the block. But next to that house is another one. That's okay. That's another picture of it. Next to it is another house. Okay, here's a picture of Mr. Payne. Yeah, I'm glad Paul found this today. He's in our mayor's book. He was mayor for, I think, just 1 year. But anyway, but it was his widow that lived in that house. Okay, here's yes.
Jack, can you hear me? This is Linda.
Hey, Linda.
The Reuben Payne that Anne Armstrong knew, that was her contemporary. He was the son of the mayor.
The son. Okay, the son. Okay, all right. So, but the mayor seems to have died of tuberculosis. He died of tuberculosis, but so did the father. Is that the idea?
I think so. But the mayor's son that Anne Armstrong knew,
mm-hmm.
His wife was Mary Gaines. That was her friend.
Okay.
Yes, yeah. She did live there on Clinch.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks for squaring that. The Gaines family house sounded like a fun place to be. The Gaines, that was the house that was sometimes open well into the night, and that she had a great description of the parties there. But anyway, next to that house, and this is another house that was moved. This was the Richard T. DeArmond house, and it was the subject of a major effort by preservationists to save it. This house was originally across the street on the corner, and again, it's a case of a nice corner house that unfortunately had to be wedged into a place where you don't see the corner effect of the wraparound porch quite as well as it appeared originally. But we're glad that house has been saved. A developer thought this would look better as about 6 parking places in the big parking lot across the street. And he first proposed to demolish the house. And a lot of people, it really caused quite a stir in Fort Sanders because this was one of the most eye-catching Queen Anne houses in Fort Sanders. And this was there was an effort to try to raise money to move it somewhere. He said he would be willing to do that, and when no one stepped forward, I think he pitched in, the developer himself, and got it moved. And of course, as is the case with other houses, it's not an ideal solution because it kind of starts the clock over. This is officially, by historical standards, just a 20-something-year-old house now. But it's an interesting looking house with the tower and all this elaborate work. Queen Anne style came in to Knoxville in about late 1870s, 1880s, and was, when you think about a Victorian house, you often think about it, this elaborate Queen Anne style house. In the Victorian era, of course, during the Victorian era, they didn't call it that. I looked up at Victorian style. First referred to fashions, clothing fashions, but Queen Anne is the term that they used back in 1880 and 1896 when this house was built. Why it's called Queen Anne is a puzzle to me. Queen Anne was an early 18th century English queen who was not necessarily noted for her reign was not noted for architectural extravagance. But this was the era of roughly from 1880 to 1899 or 1900 that you see the really elaborate residential architecture that people seem to love, that people like George Barber relished in and made his career on. A lot of the houses in Fort Sanders, most of the ones we know of, were not designed by George Barber, but by Bowman brothers, who did a lot of big commercial buildings. They were well known for that, but they also dabbled in residential architecture now and then. I'm not completely sure who the architect for this house was, but it's still there. It's wedged into and here's a relic of that effort to save it. This is a Chris McAdoo print from around 2000, when there were attempts to try to save the DeArmond house originally where it was, and then actually when they actually moved it across the street. I was there the day they actually very slowly moved that giant house across the street. So there are 2 houses on Clinch Avenue. If anybody asks you where's the house that was moved, there are actually 2 of them: the Schmidt house and the DeArmond house, kind of plugged into places alongside other houses from their same era on the same street. But DeArmond was a kind of a tragic figure. I looked him up. Was a really kind of a Gothic sort of a figure. He was a guy who had been accused of murder in Newport. Was actually tried for murder and found not guilty. But he was very popular in Knoxville and was considered. He was called the custodian of the courthouse and lawn, but I think it's more like being the physical plant director of the courthouse, because it was a respected position and he had a say about where things went and that sort of thing. When they were building the new courthouse, DeArmond was there and was kind of putting kind of moving furniture and putting things where they belonged. He was also involved in the exhumation and reburial of John Sevier, and who's of course was buried in a field in a forest in Alabama that later became a cotton field, but was in late 1880s, was reburied on the courthouse lawn, and that's what the big shaft is for. But DeArmond was actually wielding the shovel in Alabama, digging up the bones of John Sevier. And later on, he was elected to state legislature and he had a political career. But something started going wrong with his life. He was a courthouse guy, was a kind of worked as a clerk in the courthouse, but he began having awful, violent arguments with people. People said that he was unstable and violently so. He ended up in a in Lions View mental institution, and not about 2-3 years after he built this house. So his wife had some serious anxiety during the time that she lived here. And then he died rather suddenly in 1898. I think it may have been suicide, but his wife, not expecting to be another widow of Widow's Row, was a widow there. But a very interesting guy who might make an interesting study. I know more about him now than I did the first time that I tried to look him up a few years ago. Next one, please. All right, here's around the corner down on White Avenue is the Woodruff Carriage House. This is one of the oldest structures in Fort Sanders. It was built for the Woodruff Mansion, which Anne Armstrong mentioned. Woodruff, of course, was the hardware dealer, major hardware dealer on Gay Street, former Union officer. Who built one of the biggest mansions on Cumberland Avenue. It was torn down in the 1920s, but the carriage house was left, and this is still there and has been used by the university for many years. It's not only one of the oldest buildings in Fort Sanders, but one of the oldest buildings associated with the UT campus. But even though it was not originally part of UT. But next one, please. And here's the Hoskins Library, the front side. You can see Hoskins, of course, this was built in 1932, I think, finished in 32 on a Charlie Barber design. And Charlie Barber, as you can see, loved medieval touches. You can post archers up there if you need to on top of the library. But that's anyway, a very interesting building. It was meant to be much bigger than it was, but it ran into the Great Depression, and they had to amend the plans, which originally had there were plans for a courtyard inside, but what is there is wonderful. It's got a great staircase inside and all that. But this is kind of part of Fort Sanders, and also kind of represents the beginning of UT's incursion into what had been an entirely residential neighborhood at this time. Next one, please. All right, this is a site we just had. This is a modern building, a fairly recent building that's on the site of the Wiley sisters' studio. This is Catherine Wiley, and later her sister Eleanor had their art studio here. Catherine Wiley, of course, is the best known artist of her era, was the Impressionist artist. I think did a lot of her most famous paintings on this site in a house, not in this building, obviously, but in a house, and they had a shed behind it that where they stored some of the paintings. But this was the area that Anne Armstrong moved to later. She knew the McAdoos, who were kin to the Wileys, so she knew, and the Schmidts. She knew everybody on this block, so you could read about that in the chapter that's called White Avenue. Chapter 20 of the book is called White Avenue, and she describes moving in and what a joy it was to move back to Fort Sanders after having lived in unhappily in North and East Knoxville before moving back to this wonderful place where she felt at home. Next one, please. All right, we threw this in. This is a giant modern building that was built about 15 or 20 years ago. Big residential building. A lot of people hate it. It actually looks like a weird thing from a dream to me. I think it could have been worse. But this was built on the site of what's known as the Rose Hole, and anybody over my age remembers the Rose Hole is a practice field, a place where they have pep rallies, bonfires. They say the first softball games that were played in Knoxville were played in the Rose Hole. It was kind of an informal, athletic, all-purpose field. But that was, as Charles mentioned, it's called Volunteer Hall. But it was, I think it was it looks like, I'm not a geologist, but it looks like it was a major sinkhole the Rose Hole, and because it was just a deep depression where nobody built anything for a long time, and that's why it was a place for sports. I think there's a house or two on one side and a row of businesses there. But on the lip of the Rose Hole, there were a few structures, but in the Rose Hole itself, it was, I think, just way down there and only good for softball. But it was just interesting to see that how that's been kind of ignored and kind of built over as if it never happened. The Rose Hole the Rose Hole part is now the parking garage under all this stuff. Next one, please. All right, this is the Highlander Monument on Clinch Avenue at 16th, very close to the Rose Hole area, and it's an interesting monument built set up in 1918. This was established by the New York Highlanders, who were defending Fort Sanders, but they chose to put up a monument that shows reconciliation so many years after the war between the blue and the gray. And that's what they show in that bas relief on the stone. I looked up there's an interesting poem inscribed or engraved in the monument that is by a New York journalist who's not all that well known, but the poem may be his best. This may be the best known use of his work here on the corner of Clinch and 16th. Next one, please. All right, this is the not too far from there, another homage to the Union, the William Rule House. William Rule was a Union officer, and he lived in this house. There he is, one of the most beloved figures of his era in Knoxville. He was a long time journalist, editor for the Old Journal and Tribune, and later the Knoxville Journal. In fact, he was editor of the Journal until he died of appendicitis at age 89. I think he died in this house in 1928. But he's known in Knoxville for lots of things. He was elected mayor twice, but he's known nationally in journalism history as the mentor of Adolph Ochs, the first boss editor and advisor of the guy that founded the modern New York Times. And Ochs was very fond of Rule. Had a letter from Rule, letter of introduction from Rule, framed on his wall in his office in Times Square. But a guy who had a big impact on all things. Also one of the early historians of Knoxville, I should point out. He wrote in 1900 the Standard History of Knoxville. He lived in Fort Sanders most of his life after the Civil War. He lived here mainly in his last 15 or 20 years in this house. Anyway, fairly a modern compared to some of the other houses in Fort Sanders. I think it was built in the early 20th century. Next one, please. All right, just down the way is the home of a lady I got to know a little bit, Evelyn Miller, who was, you might have heard of the Evelyn Miller piano series. Paul found a picture of her, a very elegant lady, lived in a very, the entire inside of this house, she lived in there as if she lived in Vienna or something. It was this wonderful continental decor, big grand piano in her living room, which is on the front left corner there. But she just ignored the chaos around her. She lived in there into the 1980s when Fort Sanders was mainly a student ghetto, but she acted like she didn't even notice that. She just kept living her life and teaching her piano lessons. She became kind of well known for teaching some well-known musicians who made a big name for themselves in New York, including a guy that won some conductor, Broadway conductor who won some Tonys in New York named Pippin, I think. Anyway, she lived there for many years, from the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s. And I interviewed her back in 1983 because she was one of the very few surviving people who remembered the Rachmaninoff concert of 1943 and had remembered it very vividly because he was one of her heroes. Anyway, next one, please. All right, here's the Ronald McDonald House. This was built in the early 20th century to be the home of a civil engineering professor at UT who I think founded the civil engineering department there. But interesting, beautiful house, kind of moving away from the Victorian, the Queen Anne ideal into the more kind of formal look of the turn of the century, Beaux-Arts or whatever you want to call that, of the early 20th century. Next one, please. Okay, here's the Albert Bowman Sr. house. Albert Bowman Sr. was the only guy who was a member of both Bowman Brothers and Bowman, two of the important architectural firms of that era. But was the much younger brother of Joseph Bowman, who founded the Bowman Brothers firm, and the father of A.B. Jr., who was when it was Bowman and Bowman. But this, I didn't even actually realize this until Holly Cook of Knox Heritage pointed out to me that this is where he lived in his last 20 years or so, when he was still a very active architect in his 60s and 70s. But still standing on Clinch Avenue. Next one, please. All right, this is the original Fort Sanders Hospital, believe it or not, 1922, when it was kind of a pretty place that you wouldn't mind spending a few days after you got your tonsils out or something. But lovely, kind of a Tudor, I guess, style, English style hospital. It seems like almost all hospitals are beautiful when they first build them, and then they just start adding. I guess it's just the nature of the medical business, that things are always changing, and you're always getting a lot more patients than you're ready for. But anyway, this was built in 1922, right when after the flu epidemic. People were saying, "Gosh, we don't have enough hospitals in Knoxville," and here we have at least one more. Here we had this was the first big hospital after General Hospital, which had been there since about 1900, up at Dameron Avenue. But as you know, we have a bit of history about Fort Sanders Hospital, which is many square blocks now, but in the same place. And it was named for Fort Sanders in 1922, which may or may not have had some remnants left at that late date. It was about that time that Fort Sanders, you stopped seeing people mentioning the ruins of Fort Sanders. Next one, please. All right, and here's the Confederate Monument, which is much smaller than the Union Monument, but it's actually roughly on the site of where 129 young men died, not knowing what for, as they charged up a steep hill and just impossible odds, and many of them were blown apart by grenades. But they say both Union and Confederate veterans attended this dedication in 1914. Next one, please. All right, here's the Laurel Theater, which a lot of us know pretty well. I've been to countless shows there and talks and things. But my late friend Gid Fryer was especially fond of this building. This was built, of course, not to be a performing arts center as it is now, but to be a church. This is a Fort Sanders Presbyterian Church. And they named it Fort Sanders Presbyterian not because it was in a neighborhood called Fort Sanders. The neighborhood was called West End, but because it was very close to the remnants of actual Fort Sanders. It was still there when they built this church. And in fact, when they built it, and this was built, by the way, I mentioned George Barber didn't design much in Fort Sanders, but he is credited with designing this particular church, at least laying out the original designs for it. But at the time, this church was built in 1898 at a time when nearby were camped soldiers who were training to go to war in the Spanish-American War. There were recruits from all over the country who were here. They knew the stories of Fort Sanders, and they actually pitched in nickels and quarters to pay for an elaborate stained glass window facing 16th Street, which was then 8th Street. commemorating the Civil War, because they knew how close this was to the actual Fort Sanders. And they say it was just a wonderful, unique stained glass window that unfortunately was the major loss when this building caught on fire in 1982, and that they say that that window just melted, and they were not able to recover it. That window is still, the window is still there, but it's just a plain glass window. But this was a church for many decades. Was later, I think, when I lived in Fort Sanders, it was an ecumenical church, but has been Laurel Theater since the 80s, I guess. Next one, please. All right, I want to mention Laurel High School, which closed a few years ago as a high school. I guess it's a residence again. It was built to be that to begin with, but it was an interesting kind of offbeat high school for kids who are artsy or just different. I think it was a place where kids could kind of educate themselves in their own and take off in their own directions. I got to speak there a few times, and it was an interesting experience, because the kids were not they were not told or expected to respect the speakers, and it was an interesting challenge when I went there. But anyway, next one, please. All right, this is very nearby up on Laurel Avenue, the R.R. Swepson House. You wouldn't guess it, but the guy that built this house was a bachelor. I think he lived there alone, maybe with some servants, in the 1890s. But he was a very wealthy guy from Virginia. Actually, had been in charge of streetcar railway development in Richmond, Virginia, before he came to Knoxville. And he was kind of an all-purpose industrialist here. Just made a lot of money and didn't have any kids to spend it on, so he spent it on his house. This house has been, different people have remarked on this house. It's very unusual for its era or ours, but people have said it looks like a church. No, it looks like a steamboat. No, what is it really? But interesting old place. Next one, please. All right, here's the George Helm house, where our friend Randall DeFord lives today, the architect. But this George Helm was a mantle manufacturer who built this house partly as a showplace for his mantles. But he along with C.B. Atkin, were two internationally known mantle manufacturers here in Knoxville. And Helm wanted to have this, the story goes that Helm wanted to have this house finished by 1910 in time for the Appalachian Exposition, because he knew people from around the country would be here, and he might be able to coax them into coming to look at his mantles in his house on Laurel Avenue. But wonderful place. It's also has a distinction of being one of the very, very few houses remaining that are visible and identifiable in the movie All the Way Home with Robert Preston from 1963. This house served as the funeral parlor, and I got to be with the the kid who played the Rufus character, and had a very kind of emotional reunion with this house when we walked into it, because he remembered it extremely well, and that day of very melancholy shooting there with about the father's funeral and from a death in the family. Next one, please. All right, I want to point out James Agee Park, which is there and established by kind of an interesting band of people, from everybody from R.B. Morris was a key figure in planning this park, and also Wilma Dykeman in her final years was very interested in this park, and Dee Dee Agee, Agee's daughter, who has since died, was here for the dedication of the park about 20 years ago. But a cool place that had a great reading of Knoxville Summer 1915 in 2015 on the 100th anniversary of that memorable summer. That's Mr. Agee himself. He died at age 45 of a heart attack. He never, not a guy who took care of himself, but did a lot in his short life. And here's to those who in all times have sought truth and who have told it in their art or in their living. Next one, please. Yeah, here's another shot of Agee Park. Next one. All right, here's right across the street is I'm really glad because that we still have this house, the Martin Luther Ross house. This would have been one of the more impressive houses in 1900 in Fort Sanders. And fortunately, it's still there and it's still an impressive house. It was the home of Martin Luther Ross, who was a candy manufacturer to begin with, a food wholesaler, made a lot of money in that expanding time. He died very young. He died in this house just suddenly at the age of 48 while he was reading the morning paper. But his son went on to build a house on Lions View and was one of the first, actually the first modern era of wealthy person to live on Lions View. Built a place called Ross Trevor on Lions View over near and helped establish Cherokee Country Club. So kind of moved the family legacy over that way. But the family sold this house not long after Mr. Ross's death, and it became one of the first apartment houses in Fort Sanders. It was very gracefully done, cut into apartments in 1916, more than 100 years ago, and it's still in great shape, intact, and it shows that you can reuse a house for other things, and it's not always a tragedy when it's cut into apartments because you can do it well if you work on it. But a lovely place. I think it's a Bowman Brothers triumph. But next one, please. All right, just down the way is a house that was lost, and I remember this house because I lived about a block down the street when the house before it, which Ron Childress said was the most unusual Queen Anne, most extravagant Queen Anne house in Fort Sanders. It was an enormous wooden house that caught on fire in 1980 and burned, and one of the tenants of the house actually died. Venezuelan student died in that house. And Philip Livingston, who was an arts professor at UT, decided that he wanted to build on the site of that mansion, but build something that respected history without trying to imitate the history that had been there. So this is a house that looks historic, but is also looks modern, and I think that's what he intended it to be. He and his wife lived there for some time, and now it's another private resident who lives there. So there are still some private residents in Fort Sanders, but Randall and Wes live down the street, and there several of these houses are actually owner occupied. Next one, please. All right, I'm really glad this is still here. This is kind of I guess you might say late Victorian commercial building. As Paul pointed out when we were taking pictures the other day, it has round windows, just like the ones in the old city that became notable, like on Sullivan Saloon. But this is probably circa 1900 commercial building. It's been a grocery store maybe for its entire history, but I'm really glad that it's still kind of a convenience store. And I think it's been a convenience store since before the coining of the term convenience store. It was an A&P for a while in the 1930s. It's been lots of different things. It was called the 13th Street IGA when I lived in Fort Sanders. But it was a place to get almost anything. I would get cans of celery soup for 19 cents in that place when I was short of cash. But anyway, it's very different from all the Queen Anne stuff, and they probably didn't think that much of it when they built it. But it's an interesting relic of that era. All right, here's the James Agee house, the one that he grew up in, the one that he wrote about in Death in the Family. And unfortunately, it was demolished not too long after this picture was taken. It was demolished actually as they were beginning pre-production for the movie. And they actually, the movie makers for the most famous of the 4 movies made based on Death in the Family wanted to use this house for the movie, but the developer had no idea that this house was important. He bought it just to build an apartment building there, and he was already neck deep in debt. and said, I've got to move forward with my schedule. And he in some quotations, he sounds sympathetic, unlike some developers. He sounds, I'd love to help, but I just can't without going broke. And that's one of the reasons that we at Knoxville History Project want to have a directory. We don't put a directory of houses that has some significance, whether they're on the National Register or not, that have some personal significance based on the people who lived there. But it was actually torn down the same year that they made the movie All the Way Home. And they say that when it was torn down, Cormac McCarthy came by and salvaged some of it and made an art project in Maryville from some of the bricks from the foundation. Next one. And that's what's here now is Fountain Place. It was called James Agee Apartments for a while, and I'm not sure why they changed it, except for the fact that a whole lot of people kind of bitterly made fun of the fact that they had torn down James Agee's house and to build the James Agee apartments. I think they tore down 2 houses to build these adjacent houses to build these apartments. But what this doesn't tell you is that this block is otherwise pretty much intact, and the little bit mixed block that James Agee described in his book is mostly still there, and you can still go to this block and see a lot of the houses that Agee and his family were neighbors of theirs, and that Agee remembered so vividly in his descriptions. Next one, please. All right, here's the John J. Craig house, and I don't know if you really get a sense of how cool this house is, but it looks great from all angles. James J. Craig, of course, was one of the major marble magnates of the era. And this house has porches on 3 levels, and including their young ladies who lived there having a clothing sale on the porch there. And we told them we were taking their picture, and they said that sure, that they didn't mind that a bit. But you see that cool second floor little porch, and also that just kind of window porch up on the 3rd floor. But a nice old house that's one of several that are well kept and preserved. One thing you notice about when I read Ron Childress's 1977 architectural tour of Fort Sanders is the first thing you notice is about half the houses he describes as having of special interest are gone now. They're just gone. But several of the houses, I think including this one, he describes as not in as good shape as they should be. And I think some of the houses that he described as needing some care actually have gotten that care and are in better shape than they were in the 70s. So it's not always a losing battle. Fort Sanders has been disappointing in many ways, but there's reason to hope that things sometimes do get better. All right, here's the Sunburst House, I've called it, and I've learned just this week what you see the sunburst on the gable there. This was believed to be a Bowman Brothers house from the 1890s. The very 1880s, maybe this may be earlier than the 1880s, I think it was. But this was the home of a guy named Robbins, L.L. Robbins, who was for a moment of his life was a hero. He was a locomotive engineer. You don't think about locomotive engineers living next door to lawyers and merchant princes and so forth, but they did. And locomotive engineers were a specialty field. They were professionals. And he proved that he was a professional in 1897 when something extraordinary was happening, a catastrophe was happening downtown. A whole block of buildings on Gay Street had caught fire, and the fire was getting worse and worse. It was just taking out one building after another. And the Knoxville Fire Department realized they were not prepared for a fire of this magnitude. And had been saying for years they need more fire engines, they need more men, they need more hoses, they need more everything. And they said, well, they have them in Chattanooga. They said, how are we going to get that? And Chattanooga is 100 miles away, and this fire is burning. Well, Mr. Robbins took a train to Chattanooga, drove down at a record pace, drove back, loaded up with Chattanooga's whole fire department. I think got on this train to come to Knoxville and save downtown Knoxville. And he brought this train in an hour and 51 minutes, 110 miles, driving that way. And they said it's just amazing that he got there that fast. It was nobody had ever driven from Chattanooga to Knoxville that fast. And he got here with all this equipment, and immediately the fire was still burning, and immediately went to work. And by dawn, it was out. This fire could have spread and destroyed a lot of downtown, but it was confined to one block, and destroyed that almost the whole block. But Robbins was hailed as a hero for a moment. I get the impression he was forgotten a year later, but this is where he lived with his family. And I think that's worth remembering. All right, this is a house that you might not look at twice, but it was especially appealing to Ron Childress in 1977. He said it was just a Gothic jewel. He said it was an 1880s house, and was I think it had more elaborate stuff on the porch than it does today. But a lot of it is still there, and it's just a kind of I think he just liked the composition of the house done on Forest Avenue. And as you notice in Fort Sanders, the big houses are on Laurel Avenue. The Highland has some pretty big houses, but Forest, they're getting smaller. And then of course Grand they're much smaller still down the hill, but it was all the same neighborhood. And Anne Armstrong actually mentions that in her book, that there are mansions next to shacks, as she puts it, in Fort Sanders. Next one, please. All right, this is something I just want to throw in, kind of from vanity, remembering my youth, because we love the Strip, but this is what we call the anti-strip, and this was this little end of Forest, and a lot of it's been developed away and can't even point to where it was, because the whole block of Forest is gone now. But there were a couple of restaurants over here. There was a really great cheap beer store. There were a couple of nightclubs, a place called Vatican Pizza, which is a pizza place that had punk rock at night, and poetry readings and so forth. It was a kind of an unpredictable little node of Fort Sanders that I got well acquainted with in the early 80s. But looking into it, I look into the history behind it. The first Arabic restaurant in Knoxville history was the Bahu, and it was opened down here in 1970 or 71 by Fuad Bahu, who was from Palestine. But that was there. There was another old place called the Parsley Tree, I think. But later on, there was a Mexican place called Los Charros, and but a lot of interesting places there over the years. But I think that the Hill, the big bar, is kind of maybe seen as kind of a legacy of the anti-strip era. Next one, please. All right, we're coming down, wrapping up here. We're down on 11th Street now, and these three houses in particular were almost torn down. And when I moved into Fort Sanders in 1979, I'd heard they were going to be torn down. I went down with my old Brownie camera and took some black and white pictures of them. They were covered with vines. They were not only empty, they were completely overgrown with vines, and they looked really picturesque, I thought. And I thought, I'm probably the last person ever to take a picture of these buildings. But what happened next? Well, people started talking about a World's Fair. And one thing you can say about the 1982 World's Fair, it has a great record for preservation, which is something World's Fairs had never been known for before. But they saved 7 Victorian houses up here all along 11th Street and used them well, and they're all still there today, I'm glad to say. And they're all residences for the most part, and they're pretty well kept and pretty to look at. And here's this is what used to be part of Laurel Avenue, but is now called Victorian Way. And here's an actual picture that Paul found of from the 1982 World's Fair of tourists. And I don't know if you might recognize anybody there, but this was the Clydesdale Pub, and I think both of these buildings were connected to Budweiser, and that was the Clydesdale stables were just down the hill, and they had a beer garden in the back, a great big kind of terraced porch in the back where you could go and drink your Budweiser. But the fair was fun at times. Is that it, Paul? Yeah. Well, that's our quick take on Fort Sanders. We could talk about Fort Sanders for some hours, but there's a lot. There was a battle in 1863, and there are a lot of battles going on now between UT and the hospital and the people who live there, and the developers who are just looking for cheap ways to house students. But it's still I've said this before, it's Knoxville's most famous neighborhood. I think it's most creative neighborhood, considering all the writers. I mean, Joseph Wood Crouch, Bernard Schmidt, James Agee, Anne Armstrong, and musicians and artists like Catherine Wiley and Eleanor. It's just a very fertile place. It's also the highest density neighborhood in East Tennessee, as you may know, which can be good and bad. Tends to always be interesting.